Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you would like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. On today's episode, Janna Vassil joins this episode to discuss helping autistics in finding meaningful and long-lasting employment. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Janna, thanks so much for joining me here on Autism Stories.
I'm happy to be here.
I'd love to start out our conversation by learning about your story. Where would you say your story in the autistic community begins?
So I would say it was when I went to university and joined a support group for students on the autism spectrum. And then I just started meeting other people that were on a spectrum that were not in the group. And it was like an aha moment for me, really. I could finally relate to other people for the first time in my life. When I started meeting more people, their experiences mirrored my experiences when it came to socializing and knowing how to behave in social situations. It was like, wow, these people actually understood me, and I felt like I belonged somewhere for the first time. It started out on a volunteer basis and very informal, but I really enjoyed helping people with their resumes. And they would also approach me when they needed help practicing for an interview. And then I realized that this is what I wanted to do with my life. And I was also juggling several part-time jobs back then. So eventually I found work as a job coach at a small nonprofit organization. And this was my dream job at the time. And then career coaching and recruiting ended up becoming my two great passions. And I worked with the autism community on and off throughout my career. So I started out, just wanting to make some friends, joined a support group, and it turned into a career for me. And currently, I'm with this organization called Springboard, where I work with a very diverse set of clients, many of whom happen to be neurodivergent as well.
Now, you are currently a recruitment and retention specialist in which you provide 100% free support for job seekers as well as employers looking to fill important positions in their organization as a result of funding by the Ontario government. What are some of the biggest barriers you see neurodivergent people face in employment services when they initially come to you for support?
I think the biggest barrier I've seen so far is interviewing, by far the biggest barrier. And neurodivergent job seekers knowing how to present themselves to interviewers specifically. So I won't go into personal details about any of my clients, but I will give you my own situation as an example. It was always a challenge for me to make any small talk at interviews. I was never comfortable talking to interviewers about their pets, their kids, their vacations, and so on. I would then get feedback that I was not a culture fit for organizations or that I was too stiff and formal. Everyone has different challenges, I find, when it comes to the interview process. Interviews are all about following a social script, which is not always easy to navigate for divergent job seekers. I've seen such examples in my work too, where the role could involve stocking shelves, customer service, or technical role. Doesn't matter what the role is. I would get feedback from employers about my neurodivergent clients that they're just not sure about the candidate, and they kind of got a not so great vibe from the candidate based on the way the candidate presented themselves. And I find that, skill set and experience are, of course, very important, But that first impression and the ability to relate to the interviewers is what sways hiring decisions in many cases. And that's very unfortunate. I find that employers are missing out on a lot of qualified talent that way.
A big aspect in finding employment is about who you know. But in many cases, I think we as autistic people have small support networks. So finding employment as a result of these smaller networks, I think it makes it even more challenging. Do you see traditional networking, such as networking events, helpful to neurodivergent people? Or have you seen other ways of networking to be more successful?
So I'll give you my very biased answer because I'm a huge fan of networking events myself. At Springboard, where I currently work, we organize lots of job fairs. And the advice that I would give autistic job seekers if they do decide to attend networking events is to seek out connections that are or could potentially be useful to you in your career. Don't go to an event unless you've identified at least one organization or one individual that you'd like to connect with at that event. So having good research skills is key. And if you don't have good research skills, find someone who can help you, such as a career coach. Locate those key individuals when you do your research. Locate those key individuals that are hiring for the jobs you want, or make the hiring decisions at the organizations where you'd like to work, and find out which networking events they attend. Then once you decide to attend an event, prepare 1 or 2 questions in advance that will help you learn more about that organization. So an example of a good question would be, can you share some really cool projects that someone has done at your company recently? I'd really be interested to check them out. Or something like, if someone wants to work for your company, what's the hiring process like? This will help you get a lot of good insights. And when you do end up approaching a potential connection, when you get to the event, the first thing you want to do is introduce yourself briefly, like, hello, my name is so-and-so, and I'm really interested in learning more about this organization. And your attitude should be one of curiosity. You're basically there to listen and learn. And as they tell you more about the organization, just listen. And when they're done talking, you can ask your questions and then listen some more. You'll be really surprised about what you can learn that way about the organization's culture, company culture, and hiring process, and whether you're even a good fit for that place, whether you even want to work there. And at the end of the conversation, ask for the person's business card, or you can send them a LinkedIn connection request after the event.
I really like what you said about curiosity, because that's what I bring, hopefully, to each episode and interview here on Autism Stories. And I think that's a really important part of the process. I'm just wondering, when you talk to new clients about this, is that something that they're able to relate to? Is that something surprising to them? What's kind of the general initial feedback about educating each person regarding that?
I think people come into this with not knowing where to go, what to do. There tends to be a lot of confusion. Some people have had really bad experiences with networking events where they just go in and they're lost and they don't really know how to make small talk, who to talk to, that kind of thing. I always give people the advice, don't worry about it. You can skip the small talk. You can stop trying to just talk to everyone. Just focus on a few key people that you want to connect with. And I think education is a process. It takes a while. So you start with baby steps. You start with giving people a few.
Preparing for interviews, I think, is an interesting process, because I think being neurodivergent, you prepare for something such as interviews that typically is not very accessible to us. So what ways do you think interviews can be more accessible?
I think employers can do a lot more to make interviews more accessible, and it starts with being open-minded and seeing differences as an asset. So, for example, asking the candidate prior to the interview if they need anything to help make their interview a better and smoother experience. Perhaps send them the questions in advance if they requested. Also, allowing a job coach or support person to accompany the candidate to the interview can be helpful for some people. When employers are interviewing, they should really focus on assessing the candidate's skill set and fit for the role, such as asking questions that relate directly to the role and the performance of that role. Employers can also invite the candidate for a paid trial run so that they can see the person in action and assess their work beyond that interview. And finally, interviewers also need to understand that not everyone is comfortable making small talk. I know it's very normalized in Western culture, but it should also be normalized, the fact that, not everyone is comfortable with it. And maybe there are other things that can be discussed at interviews that are more relevant to the position itself.
I think as autistic people, it's one thing for us to find employment, but retaining that employment is much more challenging. So what advice do you have to some of our listeners in regards to this?
But here's the thing, when it comes to retention, when someone first starts in a new role, they feel all excited and eager, and the employer is likewise excited about the new hire. Eventually, tensions will start to happen. Sometimes people will clash over various things. There are conflicts with coworkers. Being on the autism spectrum, I know that I've always felt lost when it comes to understanding the nuances of the office social scene. So there have been cases in my previous roles where a colleague would tell me that something I said or did bothered them, and it would come practically out of nowhere because it was never my intention to do that. Or another example, sometimes colleagues perceived me as rude because I would just sit at my desk and do my work and not really socialize with anyone at the office. This is just what felt comfortable for me. I found socializing very stressful and distracting. Misunderstandings happen, and the best advice I can give is to be honest with yourself and your colleagues. If a conflict happens, you should ideally address it directly with the person involved. Don't wait for it to turn into something bigger than what it really is. If things escalate, you can go to your supervisor or HR. Unfortunately, people on the autism spectrum are often perceived as having poor communication skills, and this is due to having a communication style that's different from the widely accepted norm. Letting people know how you communicate goes a long way towards removing and preventing those misunderstandings. For example, if I were to say something like, socializing is very stressful for me, so I spend a lot of time at my desk doing my work. I'm not trying to ignore you. So that will let my colleagues know that what I'm doing by sitting at my desk is trying to be as productive and stress-free as I can be and not being rude to them. So several years ago, I started doing more of this, and it helped me feel less stressed at work and generally happier, where I actually want to stay in the same job for a long time. And finally, just be yourself and remember that if who you are is not acceptable to your employer, this is just not the place for you. And you may be a job hopper for a while until you find that workplace to call home where you can just be yourself.
And I think that's the thing. I think for a lot of us as autistic people, we go to work, and that can be something that is not always understood. I'm wondering, I'd like to learn a little bit more about your own job-seeking experience, because I think as autistic people, when we're in a position where we've retained employment, that probably just means we've learned from a lot of not so good experiences. You were talking about job hopping. We've had maybe not many good experiences in employment when maintaining employment didn't work out. I'd love to know more about your personal journey in employment.
My journey's been a lot of learning from bad experiences. There was one incident I recall when I was a placement student, and my placement supervisor told me that because of your disability, you should not be in this field. And that was very discouraging for me, and I remember feeling upset about it for a long time. I started working at 19, and it took me 11 years to get to a place where I didn't dread going to work, where I actually felt like an asset to the organization I worked for and not a burden on them. It took a lot of self-acceptance for me to actually realize that I needed to find a workplace that works for me and not just a place that will take me. And as a 19-year-old, I was really desperate to get a job, so I never really thought about what worked for me and what I needed out of a job. But now with more work and life experience, I'm very selective about the types of roles that I'm willing to take on.
And lastly, how can our listeners learn about you and your services beyond this conversation?
So the best way to find me is LinkedIn. My name is Janna Vassil, and I'm the one known as the job squirrel. So I got the little squirrel in my tagline. I run a page on LinkedIn that works as a resource for job seekers. I post job opportunities there and links to our hiring events. And if anyone lives in Ontario, Canada, and they're looking for additional support, they can just Google Springboard Employment Services and check us out.
And Janna, thanks so much for joining me here on Autism Stories. It was great to learn about your story.
Yeah, likewise, it was great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much to Janna for the conversation. To learn more about Janna, please check out the link in the podcast description for this episode. We always love hearing from you and would especially love to hear from you relating to this episode on, as an autistic person, what is the most important aspect to you when seeking employment? Did you know Autism Personal Coach provides neurodiversity affirming support by autistics for autistics? We empower autistic adults and teens to lead self-directed, purpose-driven lives through our customized life coaching and community groups. Our distinct approach prioritizes each client's unique goals and preferences, fostering a sense of agency and promoting self-advocacy. Coaches work collaboratively with clients to develop personalized strategies and tools that can help with executive functioning, emotional regulation, relationship building, stress management, and much more. We also support parents and partners of autistic people by providing insights and guidance to bridge communication gaps and nurture mutual understanding. With our accessible remote services, people from any location can receive the assistance and mentoring they need. So join us today to experience judgment-free coaching rooted in empathy, expertise, and respect for autistic identity. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.